I was still dizzy from the anesthesia when I reached for my phone and called my daughter. My hip throbbed like something inside it had been rearranged, which I suppose it had. "Vanessa," I whispered, "I'm out of surgery. I can't really move yet." There was a pause. Then her husband Derek's voice drifted in from somewhere behind her. "Tell her we already talked about this." Another pause. Then Vanessa sighed. "Mom, we have the contractors at the house all week. You know how complicated this renovation has been." The call ended. I lay there staring at the water stain on the ceiling tile, and I remember thinking, I raised that girl through 2 hurricanes, a bankruptcy, and the death of her father, and she couldn't take 3 days off for a hip replacement. A few minutes later, a woman in teal scrubs walked in and adjusted the pillow behind my head without being asked. She was maybe 40, with tired eyes and a calm that felt practiced but genuine. "You comfortable?" she asked. I said I was fine. I wasn't. But I'd been saying I was fine for so long it came out automatically. She smiled anyway. "I'll check back in 20 minutes. She didn't have to, but she did. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever felt invisible to the people who were supposed to love you most? Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. People talk about grief like it's always tied to death. But I lost my husband Franklin Marsh to a heart attack 8 years ago. And somehow, that wasn't the loneliest I'd ever felt. The loneliest I ever felt was lying in a recovery room at 67 years old, watching a nurse I'd never met treat me with more tenderness than my own daughter had in years. Franklin and I had lived in our house in Asheville, North Carolina for 31 years. He built furniture by hand in the garage on weekends, walnut bookshelves, a dining table that seated 12, a rocking chair he gave me the Christmas before he died. After he passed, the house didn't feel like a home anymore, so much as a record of everything we'd been. But it was mine, and it was paid for. Vanessa grew up in that house. She and Derek settled 40 minutes away in a newer neighborhood, the kind with a homeowners association, and a gate that didn't actually keep anyone out. They had one son, my grandson Eli, who was 14 and still called me on my birthday without being reminded. That detail mattered more to me than I usually admitted. The morning of my surgery, I sat alone in the pre-op room, watching a morning show I couldn't hear because they'd taken my hearing aids to store with my other belongings. Nurses came and went. The anesthesiologist introduced himself and left. I kept looking at the door. Vanessa had promised she'd be there before they took me in. "We'll be there, Mom. Don't worry." She'd said it with the particular lightness people use when they have no intention of following through. By the time they wheeled me toward the OR, no one had come. I told myself it was fine. I was a grown woman. Plenty of people had surgery alone, but somewhere between the hallway and the operating room, I started to cry. Just a little, and I was grateful for the mask they'd put over my face. When I woke up, the pain was immediate and blinding. I groaned before I could stop myself. A hand appeared from somewhere to my left and rested lightly on my arm. "You're okay," a voice said. "You did great." Her name was Lena Forsythe. I didn't learn that until the next day, when I finally felt well enough to read the badge clipped to her scrubs. She was the nurse assigned to my recovery floor, and over the next 3 days, she became the most consistent human presence in my life. She helped me sit up the first time. She brought me a warm washcloth when I woke up sweating from the medication. She told me the physical therapist was running behind and sat with me in the hallway for 6 minutes, rather than leaving me to wait alone. Small things. But small things are enormous when you're in pain and frightened, and no one you love has come. Vanessa called on the second evening. I let it ring twice before answering. "How are you feeling?" Her voice was distracted. I could hear Derek talking in the background, and the particular sound of a television program at moderate volume. "I need some help when I get home," I said carefully. "Maybe a week or 2, just until I can manage the stairs safely." Silence then. "Mom, Derek's mom is already staying with us." I hadn't known that. "She flew in for Eli's spring showcase," Vanessa continued. "We really don't have the room right now." I didn't say anything for a moment. I watched a cart roll past in the hallway outside my open door. "I carried you through a C-section recovery when you were 28, I said finally. "I slept on your couch for 11 days. She said that was different. I didn't ask her how. That night, Lena found me awake at 11:30. She was ending a long shift and came in to check my vitals one last time. She noticed my expression immediately. "Bad call?" I laughed, short and humorless. "My daughter can't make room for me." Lena didn't try to fix it. She didn't say, "I'm sure she loves you." She didn't defend Vanessa or offer some softened version of the situation. She simply pulled the chair close to my bed and sat down. "Do you have anyone else?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. My sister Pauline lived in Arizona and was dealing with her own health issues. My friend Carol from church would help but couldn't do the stairs. The truth was no, not really. Not in the practical way a post-surgery recovery required. Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me about your house." So I did. I told her about Franklin's table, the rocking chair, the garden he started. And I'd kept going for 8 years alone. The view from the back porch where you could see the ridge of the mountains on a clear morning. She listened the way people only listen when they're genuinely interested, not waiting for their turn to speak. Before she left, she said something I kept returning to. "You deserve to be somewhere you feel safe." I didn't know how to answer that. I wasn't sure anyone had said something like that to me in a very long time. The hospital discharged me on a Thursday. Vanessa arrived to pick me up 45 minutes late. She didn't apologize for the wait. Derek was driving, and he barely looked back at me when I got in. The ride home was mostly quiet. Vanessa mentioned the renovation twice. She said something about Eli's grades. When we pulled into my driveway, Derek carried my bag to the door and Vanessa walked me inside and spent 7 minutes showing me where she'd left a casserole in the refrigerator. Then she hugged me quickly. "Call if you need anything, okay?" They were gone before I'd settled into the armchair. The house felt different after surgery. Or maybe I did. The kitchen suddenly seemed far from the bedroom. The stairs I'd climbed 10,000 times now felt like a serious negotiation. I spent the first evening alone, moving slowly between the chair and the bathroom, and back again, eating crackers, because heating the casserole seemed like too much. I found the problem on the 4th day. I'd gone into Franklin's study to find the insurance paperwork my discharge instructions required. The desk drawer where I kept important documents was unlocked, which I thought was strange because I always kept it locked. I opened it and immediately noticed that things had been moved. I kept everything in a certain order. It was a habit Franklin instilled in me, and the folders were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not emptied, just shifted. I stood there for a long moment with my hand on the drawer. Then I found the sticky note in Derek's handwriting. It was tucked behind the property tax file. Just 3 words: copy, real estate, nothing else. My mouth went dry. I sat down in Franklin's chair and stared at that note for a long time. Derek had been in my house while I was in the hospital. I hadn't given anyone a key, but I kept a spare under the ceramic pot by the back door. Vanessa had known about it since she was a teenager, and Derek had been in my study, looking at my property documents, and had left a note about copying something related to real estate. I tried to tell myself there was an innocent explanation. I spent the better part of an afternoon trying. I couldn't find one. That evening I called Lena. I almost didn't. It was after 7, and I felt foolish calling someone I'd only known in a hospital room. But she had written her number on the back of a pamphlet before I left and said, "If you need anything at all." I held that pamphlet for 20 minutes before dialing. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I'd found. She listened without interrupting, the same way she'd listened in the hospital. When I finished, she was quiet for just a moment. Then she said, "Has your daughter talked to you recently about the house?" I thought back over the past few months. Vanessa had mentioned in passing that the property values in my neighborhood had gone up considerably. She'd made a comment at Thanksgiving about how a house that size was a lot to maintain alone. I'd brushed it off at the time. "I think I need to talk to someone," I said. "A lawyer, maybe." Lena agreed. She came over the next morning before her shift. She brought coffee and helped me go through the desk drawer systematically. We found the sticky note again, and behind a folder I hadn't moved, a piece of paper I didn't recognize, a handwritten list of figures, addresses, and what appeared to be estimated sale prices for properties in my zip code. My address was at the top. The number beside it made my stomach turn, not because it was wrong, because someone had been calculating what my home was worth without asking me. This didn't come from nowhere, Lena said carefully. I knew she was right. 2 days later, Vanessa called. Her voice had that particular brightness she used when she was about to say something she'd practiced. Derek and I have been thinking, she began, and we're worried about you in that house long term. It's a lot for one person's, especially now. I stayed quiet. There are some really wonderful communities nearby, she continued. Independent living, very social, you'd have people around. I said I had people around. She said that wasn't what she meant. Vanessa, I said, did Derek go into my house while I was at the hospital? A pause. Too long a pause. He just checked on things, Mom. Made sure the heat was on. He was in the study. Another pause. He was just making sure everything was in order. Looking at property documents, I said, is not the same as making sure the heat is on. The silence after that felt like a held breath. Then Vanessa said something that removed every remaining doubt. Mom, you have more house than you need, and it's not going to get easier. Not are you okay? Not I'm sorry if that felt like an invasion. She moved straight to the conclusion she and Derek had already reached between them. I need you to leave me alone for a few days, I said. I hung up before she could argue. I cried for about an hour. Then I called my husband's former attorney, a man named Howard Gable, who I hadn't spoken to since he handled Franklin's estate. He was retired now, but still took calls from old clients. He answered on the third ring, and when I said my name, there was immediate warmth in his voice. Gloria, he said, it's been too long. I told him it had, and then I told him why I was calling. He listened to everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, come see me tomorrow. Lena drove me. Howard's office was in a building downtown that smelled like old books and strong coffee, which reminded me of the way Franklin's study smelled on winter mornings. Howard himself looked older than I remembered, but he had the same focused attention I'd trusted years ago. He shook my hand and then Lena's. When I introduced her, I said, she's been helping me. Howard said, then I'm grateful to her already. I laid everything out, the drawer, the note, the list of figures, the conversation with Vanessa. Howard took his time reading through the papers and asked me clear questions without leading me toward any particular answer. When he was finished, he set his glasses on the desk. Gloria, he said, I want you to understand something about your situation. I said I was listening. Franklin structured your estate carefully, he said. The properties, the accounts. Some of it is in protected forms that Vanessa likely doesn't fully understand. But if she and Derek pursue legal guardianship arguments or medical incapacity claims, he said this slowly and deliberately, that becomes a different conversation. I looked at him steadily. Can they do that? They can try, he said. They won't succeed, but it would be unpleasant. He paused. And expensive. I said I understood. Then he told me what my estate was actually worth. I knew Franklin had been careful. I'd signed papers over the years without fully absorbing the details. The way you trust someone you love completely to handle the parts of life you find overwhelming. I hadn't realized how much had grown in the 8 years since his death. Investments, the rental property downtown he'd held since the 90s. Accounts I hadn't touched because I didn't need to. The number Howard said was more than I had imagined. Lena looked at me when he said it, just briefly, and then looked away. She didn't react with greed or excitement. She looked almost uncomfortable, the way honest people do when they suddenly understand the scale of a situation they'd stepped into by accident. I sat with the number quietly. Then I said, Vanessa and Derek's started this because they wanted the house. Howard nodded slowly. And they may not even know about everything else. That possibility made me feel something cold and complicated. That my daughter had moved to take what she thought was everything, and it wasn't even close to everything. That afternoon, Vanessa texted me. Derek spoke to a friend of his who's a real estate attorney. Just so you have options, Mom. I stared at the message. Not a question, not an apology. A declaration disguised as helpfulness. I put the phone face down on the table and looked at Lena. I want to change my will, I said. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply said, that's your decision to make. That was the moment I knew she was exactly who I thought she was. Howard drafted the revisions over the following 2 weeks. During that time, Vanessa called 3 more times. Each call followed the same arc. Pleasantries, then concern about the house, then gentle pressure toward the conclusion she and Derek had already decided. I answered once. The other 2 times, I let it ring. On the 3rd week, Vanessa arrived at my door unannounced. It was a Wednesday evening. She came alone, without Derek, which told me she'd calculated that might work better. She stood in the doorway of the living room in a coat she hadn't taken off. And she looked around the room the way people look at something they're imagining differently. "I want to talk," she said. I said she could sit down. She did, but she didn't take the coat off. That small detail said everything about how long she planned to stay. "Mom, I feel like there's been a misunderstanding." I waited. Derek was just trying to help. He thought maybe having some information ready would make things easier when the time came. "The time for what?" I asked. She looked briefly caught. "For whatever decisions need to be made." "About my house," I said. "About the future," she said. The way she said future made it clear she wasn't talking about mine. I asked her directly, "Have you been talking to anyone about selling my property?" She hesitated one beat too long. "We've just been looking into things." "Looking into things," I repeated, without asking me. "Mom, you just had surgery." "I had a hip replacement," I said. "Not a lobotomy." She blinked. I don't think I had ever said anything quite that sharp to her before. For a moment, something crossed her face that might have been genuine surprise, and underneath it, something that looked like it wanted to be shame. But then Derek texted her. I heard the notification, and the moment passed. "I think you're letting that nurse influence you," she said carefully. "Lena," I said. "Her name is Lena. You barely know her." "I know her better than I knew you were going into my desk drawers." She stood up then. Not dramatically. Vanessa was never dramatic, but with the controlled energy of someone who's decided the conversation isn't going the way they planned. "I'm trying to protect you," she said. "Vanessa," I said quietly, "you stopped coming to protect me a long time ago." She left without hugging me. I sat in the quiet for a while after the door closed. Franklin's rocking chair was empty across from me, the way it had been for 8 years, and I talked to it like I sometimes did when I needed to think out loud. "What would you do?" I already knew the answer. Franklin was the fairest man I'd ever known. He would have said, "Do what's right, not what's familiar." I called Howard the next morning. He asked me the same question Robert Hale had asked. "Are you certain?" I told him yes, and I told him why, and he nodded once and picked up his pen. What I built took several months. The Marsh Recovery Fund, named for Franklin and for me, a nonprofit endowment to provide in-home recovery assistance, transportation, and short-term care for elderly patients discharged from hospitals without adequate family support. People like I had almost been. People like the woman Lena told me about. A 73-year-old she'd cared for twice, who had gone home both times to an empty apartment and nearly fallen within 24 hours each time because there was no one there. Howard worked with me to establish the fund structure, the board, the grant criteria. Lena was named on the board, which embarrassed her considerably. She said 3 separate times that she didn't need anything from me. That was the 4th reason I trusted her. The first 3 were, she came to the hospital. She came to my house. She drove me to the lawyer without once asking what I'd decided. The personal inheritance I left her she tried to return. She sat across from Howard's desk with an expression I recognized. The look of someone who has never wanted something they're suddenly being given, and said, "This isn't why I helped her." Howard said he knew that. I told her Franklin had believed that the people who refuse money most loudly are usually the ones who've earned it most honestly. She looked at the table and didn't say anything for a while. When I filed the revised documents, Vanessa found out through Howard's formal notification, which she was legally entitled to receive. She called me that evening at 9 o'clock. Her voice was different this time. Not bright, not practiced. Tight. "What did you do, Mom?" I told her I'd made decisions about my own life and my own estate. "You're giving everything to a stranger." "I'm giving a portion to someone who treated me with dignity," I said. "The rest is going towards something Franklin would have been proud of." She said that was insane. I said it was probably the sanest thing I'd done in years. Derek got on the line. I don't know if Vanessa handed him the phone, or if he took it. He said things about legal challenges and mental competency evaluations. I told him Howard had documented everything carefully, and that he was welcome to proceed if he felt strongly. He said some other things. I waited until he ran out and then I said, Derek, I have never in 20 years asked you to love me. But I did expect basic respect. He went quiet. The day you went through my desk, I said. You showed me who you were. I hung up. Eli called me 2 days later. He was the only one who did. He said, Grandma, Dad's really mad. I told him I knew. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a teenager trying to figure out what side of something he was on. Then he said, Is the nurse lady nice? I told him her name was Lena and yes, she was very nice. He said, Good. Just that, good. I had to take the phone away from my ear for a second because my eyes were full. The next month I fell. It happened early on a Tuesday morning. I'd gotten up before dawn because I couldn't sleep. I was still adjusting to the medication. And I was trying to make tea. The floor mat in the kitchen shifted under my foot. And before I understood what was happening, I was on the ground with pain radiating through my hip like something electric. I couldn't stand. I couldn't breathe properly for a few seconds. I grabbed my phone from the counter above me, which took 3 tries. I called Vanessa. Of course I did. The way you reach for something familiar even when it's burned you before. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same. Then I called Lena. She answered before the second ring. I told her I'd fallen. She said she was coming. No sigh. No negotiation. No asking if I'd tried anyone else first. She said she was coming. And 22 minutes later I heard her car in the driveway. She came through the back door, which I'd unlocked from the floor by crawling 3 feet to the magnetic key panel. She knelt beside me and checked me methodically. Shoulder, hip, head. While talking in a steady voice about nothing important, which I later understood was to keep me from going into shock. She got me into her car carefully, and she drove me back to the emergency room at 11:30 at night, with her hair half pinned like she'd been sleeping when I called. They confirmed I hadn't re-broken the hip, but the strain was significant. I spent 2 nights in observation. Lena stayed the first night until almost 3 in the morning, sitting in the chair beside my bed reading something on her phone. When I told her to go home, she said she would in a few minutes. She didn't. Vanessa texted me the next morning. Just saw your calls, Mom. Everything okay? I stared at the message. Then I put the phone away. Eli showed up that afternoon with a balloon from the hospital gift shop. It said "Get well soon" in orange letters and bobbed too high on its ribbon for the room. He looked embarrassed by it the moment he walked in. It was the only one they had, he said. I told him it was perfect. He sat beside me for 2 hours and showed me videos on his phone about nothing in particular. And that was the best 2 hours I'd had in a very long time. The night before I was discharged, Vanessa appeared. It was past visiting hours, but she talked her way past the floor nurse and stood in the doorway of my room looking smaller than I remembered her. Derek wasn't with her. She was wearing the same coat. She looked at Lena's chair beside my bed. Lena had left an hour earlier, and something moved across her face. Mom, she said. I waited. I'm sorry I didn't answer. I looked at her steadily which time. She came in and sat down, not in Lena's chair, in the one by the window farther away. Derek pushed a lot of this, she said quietly. I nodded. And I let him, I said. She looked at her hands. Yeah. We sat in that for a while. I wasn't ready to absolve her. I'd spent enough of my life smoothing over things that should have been said plainly. Do you actually want to know what it felt like? I asked. When you didn't come before surgery. She nodded, and I thought she meant it, so I told her. I told her about the pre-op room, and the morning show I couldn't hear and looking at the door until they wheeled me away. I told her about waking up and finding a stranger's hand on my arm. I told her it was the kindest thing anyone did for me that whole week. Vanessa cried a little. I had seen her cry many times, and I couldn't always tell if it was grief or performance. And I hated that I'd become someone who thought about it that way. But this looked real. She said she hadn't understood. I said I knew. I said understanding came at a cost, and she'd paid it in the wrong direction for a while. I'm not changing things back, I told her. The fund, Lena, that stays. She nodded. I know. I looked at her for a moment. But I'm not finished with you either. Her eyes came up. You're my daughters, I said. I'm not interested in cutting you off. I'm interested in you being honest with me going forward. And Derek staying out of my desk drawers. She almost smiled. Not quite. He knows he was wrong, she said. He needs to say that himself, I told her. She stayed another hour. We didn't fix everything. You can't fix in one evening what came apart over years. But we said things that needed saying, which is where everything else has to begin. The Marsh Recovery Fund opened 6 months later in a small building on the east side of Asheville that used to be a dental office. We repainted it yellow. Franklin would have hated yellow, which made me love it. Lena became the program director, a title she accepted with visible discomfort, and then threw herself into completely. Our first resident was a woman named Agnes, who had undergone a knee replacement and had no one within 300 miles who could help her manage the first 2 weeks. She was 71 and embarrassed to need assistance. I sat with her the morning she arrived and told her I understood that feeling. I told her I'd felt it myself not so long ago. "But you're not a burden," I said. "You're just a person who needs help at the moment. That's different." She looked at me like she wasn't sure she believed that. I told her she would, eventually. Eli started volunteering on Saturdays when school was out. He helped residents with phone calls and drove small errands and sat with people who just needed someone to talk to. The week he turned 16. He told me he was thinking about studying nursing. I didn't cry in front of him. I waited until he'd left. Derek came to see me 4 months after the hospital. He came alone on a Sunday afternoon, and he sat in the kitchen with his hands around a coffee cup he barely drank from. He said he'd been wrong. He said it plainly, without qualifying it or explaining it away, which was more than I expected. I said I appreciated that. I said I hoped he understood why it mattered. He said he thought he was starting to. I told him that was enough for now. Vanessa and I talk more honestly now than we have in years. Some months are better than others. She came to the fund opening and stood near the back and didn't try to be the center of it, which was its own kind of growth. After the ribbon cutting, she found me near the entrance and said quietly, "Dad would have liked this." I told her I thought so too. There's a rocking chair in the common room at the fund. Not Franklin's, his stays on porch where it belongs, but one I found at an estate sale, solid walnut, with the same slightly uneven rhythm that his had. When I'm there in the evenings, I sometimes sit in it while the last few residents settle in for the night, and I think about how strange and specific life is. How the same wound that breaks you open is the one that shows you what you were carrying all along. I loved my daughter with everything I had. I still do. But love isn't the same as surrender. And taking care of yourself isn't the same as giving up on anyone else. The nurse who sat with me in a hospital room, who came to my house at midnight, who helped me understand I was worth something. She didn't save me because she expected anything in return. She saved me because she was paying attention at the moment I needed someone to. That's the only thing I know for certain about kindness. It has nothing to do with what someone owes you. It's just the choice to show up when you don't have to. And sometimes that choice changes everything.